The bank opened at 9 a.m. sharp, as it always did. The glass doors swung wide to welcome the steady stream of clients, businessmen in suits, retirees checking balances, young mothers with strollers and questions. Everything about the building was sterile and polished, from the marble floors that echoed every footstep, to the climate-controlled air that smelled faintly of paper, printer ink, and artificial citrus. Behind the counter, clerks tapped busily at their keyboards. In the corner, a security guard, bored and heavy-set, fiddled with his phone, half watching the lobby. The branch manager, Miss Ramsey, reviewed her schedule for the day, unaware that someone, was about to rupture their routine like a stone through glass. At 9:17, the double doors creaked again, and stepped a man. Old, black, tall, though slightly hunched, his skin, the color of earth and leather, was mapped with lines of time and toil. He wore a faded gray suit, carefully ironed, but clearly from another era. His shoes were shined, but their soles had seen years of pavement. In his right hand, he held a wooden cane, and in the other, a dusty canvas sack. The room didn't go silent, not yet, but heads turned. He didn't walk like someone asking for directions or applying for a loan. No, he moved with the solemnity of someone who had returned, someone who had history tied to this place. Miss Ramsey looked up, then glanced at the security guard. Just a routine precaution. "Good morning, sir," she called out politely. "Can I help you with something today?" The man gave no smile. His voice, when it came, was firm, low, and deliberate. "I've come to see my bank." A few chuckles stirred among the younger staff. One teller whispered something to a colleague and both snorted. The security guard crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "I beg your pardon, Miss." Ramsey's voice lost a notch of politeness. "This bank," the old man repeated, taking another step forward, the cane clicking against the floor, "used to be mine." Laughter now, scattered and uneasy. It wasn't every day someone walked in claiming ownership. He might have been homeless, or confused, or just old and lonely. But the look in his eyes said something else. This was not a joke. The bank was built on silence and protocol, but laughter, awkward, clipped, dismissive, broke through like static. It started in the far corner, where two young tellers leaned toward one another, whispering behind cupped hands. One of them, a lanky man with perfectly styled hair, muttered, "Maybe he thinks he's Morgan Freeman." The other stifled a giggle. Across the room, a customer turned her head toward the commotion, then quickly looked away, as if not wanting to intrude on something that wasn't her business. The old man didn't flinch. He stood tall, well, as tall as age would let him, and let the laughter pass through him like wind over stone. His grip tightened slightly on the cane, not in anger, in remembrance. The security guard took a step forward. "Sir, I think maybe you're a little confused," he said with a patronizing calm, the kind of tone people use with the very young or the very old. "This is a private institution. You can't just walk in and say, 'I built this institution.'" The old man interrupted. His voice didn't rise in volume, but the way he said it froze the room like sudden cold. "Brick by brick, loan by loan, and one by one, they took it from me." Silence now. Miss Ramsey stood behind the reception desk, her eyes narrowing with concern, but also with calculation. Was this man delusional, or worse, a scam artist? "Sir," she said, trying to reclaim the moment, "what exactly are you saying? Do you have an appointment?" The man stepped closer, his cane clicking with each step. His sack brushed against his side, worn and heavy. "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that before any of you wore suits, or had badges, or sat in these chairs, this place had a soul. I gave it that." The room seemed to shrink around him. Even the fluorescence above felt colder. Then he added, not looking at anyone in particular, "I came to see what they did to it, and to see if anyone would remember." From the back, a junior analyst whispered to her supervisor, "Should we call someone?" "Call someone, not listen, not ask. Call someone." The old man heard it. Of course he did. But he only sighed, deeply, like a man used to being dismissed, like a man used to waiting for the world to catch up to the truth. Before we continue, let's take a short pause. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Have you ever experienced something similar, a moment when you weren't taken seriously until it was too late? We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And now, we continue. The air inside the bank had changed. It wasn't just the chill of the air conditioning anymore, it was something weightier, something less visible, the kind of weight that settles on a room when someone says something that can't be easily laughed off. The old man's words still hung there, like the last note of a hymn, This bank used to be mine. A beat passed. Then a chuckle, too loud, too forced, burst from the tall man at the teller window. Okay, Grandpa, he said, smirking, and I used to be the king of France. Another round of uneasy laughter followed, but it was thinner now, less sure, because even in the age of cynicism, there's something unsettling about a person who speaks with too much conviction. The old man walked forward, ignoring the laughter. He stopped at the nearest counter and gently placed the canvas sack on the polished surface. A puff of dust escaped into the sterile air, like a whisper from the past. Miss Ramsey hesitated, then stepped out from behind her desk. Sir, she said again, but this time her voice was slower, careful. What is it you believe you're trying to show us? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he undid the clasp on the sack. His hands were steady, movements rehearsed. This wasn't the first time he'd opened it, but perhaps the first time in a place like this. Out came the papers, yellowed with age, corners worn like ancient scripture. Then, a small leather-bound ledger, newspaper clippings, a photograph. He placed them one by one with reverence, like artifacts on an altar. Then he spoke. This was the deed. This, he pointed to the ledger, records the first 23 loans I approved. Before there were computers, before there were even fax machines, we used to use carbon paper. His voice did not tremble, not from age, not from fear. One of the younger employees leaned in slightly now. Another walked over quietly from the back, drawn by the silence that had overtaken the room. The photograph showed a young man, strong-jawed, proud, dressed in a 1960s three-piece suit. He stood before a building half the size of this one. A wooden sign above him read, Eldridge Community Bank. You? Someone asked. The old man nodded. I started it with $5,000 and a promise to help people like me, when no one else would. When other banks saw skin before credit, we gave them a chance. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Then, just before Ms. Ramsey could respond, before we turn the page, let us ask you something. Have you or someone you know ever had your history erased or forgotten? Something you built, dismissed like it never mattered? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. And don't forget to subscribe. This story is just getting started. The room had grown smaller. Not physically, there was still plenty of space, but emotionally, psychologically, the old man's words had drawn an invisible line through the air, cutting through the surface tension like a knife. The laughter had disappeared, replaced by the kind of silence that envelopes a person just before the truth becomes undeniable. Miss Ramsey stared at the photograph for a moment longer, her fingers lightly grazing the edges of the worn paper. Her expression was unreadable, a tight mask of professionalism, but underneath, something was shifting. She had dealt with hundreds of clients, all of them with different stories. Most of them just wanted loans or answers. Some had far too much paperwork, others barely enough. But never had she encountered someone who spoke as if the very foundation of the institution she ran had been built on something other than pure commerce. It was disorienting. How is this possible? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man finally looked at her, his eyes sharp and steady. They weren't the eyes of someone trying to convince others. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, who had lived through too much to care about convincing anyone of anything. I told you, he said, each word deliberate. It was my bank. I built it for the people, but somewhere along the way, they took it from me, bit by bit. The room grew colder. The tellers had stopped speaking. The customers had stopped moving. Even the security guard stood motionless now, staring at the scene unfolding before him. A younger man in a dark suit, a corporate lawyer who had been quietly observing from the side, now took a step forward. He cleared his throat. This is an interesting story, but we need to see actual documentation, he said. You can't expect us to take your word for it without some sort of proof. For the first time, the old man's expression shifted, not in anger, but in something more dangerous, a calm, cold certainty. The proof is in the history, he said quietly. You just don't know it yet. With that, he turned and gestured to the sack again. He slowly reached in and pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed, creased, but unmistakable. Here's the proof, he said, handing it to Ms. Ramsey. This is the original agreement, signed by me, signed by the bank's founding board, back when it was just a small dream on the outskirts of this town. And here's where it all changed, where you and your investors took it from me. Miss Ramsey took the paper. She didn't look at it right away. Instead, she glanced at the lawyer standing behind her, who was now looking at her with a faint expression of concern. Slowly, she unfolded the document, her fingers trembling slightly. It was in perfect order, signature, seal, the date, January 7th, 1962. The agreement was for a loan, the first loan, the one that had kicked off the bank's existence. Her mind raced as she skimmed the text, eyes darting from line to line. This was real. It shouldn't have been, but it was. And then, she saw it. There, near the bottom of the page, were the signatures, two distinct ones. One belonged to a man she did not recognize, but the other was unmistakable, her father's name. The color drained from her face. She looked up at the old man. His gaze met hers, piercing, unblinking. The question isn't whether I own it, he said softly. The question is, what are you going to do now? Before we go on, think about this. How far would you go to reclaim something that was once yours? If you found out that something you lost, or had taken from you, was still alive, would you fight for it? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. This story is unfolding in ways you won't expect. Miss Ramsey stood still, the paper trembling in her hands. The weight of it seemed to increase with every passing second, the ink on the page becoming heavier, darker, as if it were absorbing the very air around it. She had seen that signature before, her father's, but now it seemed like a ghost standing behind her, one she couldn't escape from. The lines on the paper blurred in front of her, but the meaning didn't change. There was a chill creeping up her spine. The past she had buried so carefully for all these years, her father's legacy, the legacy of Eldridge Bank, was now standing before her, resurrected by the very man who had created it. How long have you been waiting to do this, Miss Ramsey asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if she feared the answer. The old man didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, still as a statue, as if the question itself was too trivial for him to bother with. His eyes never left hers. I've waited for a long time, he finally said, his voice low but firm. I had to be sure you were the one. You're your father's daughter, but you don't know what he really was, what he really did. You don't know how he betrayed me. The room seemed to close in around them, as if the walls themselves were listening. The few remaining customers had backed away, almost instinctively, sensing the weight of the moment. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the silence. Miss Ramsey glanced down at the paper again, her eyes scanning the details. Everything was there, the signatures, the dates, the loan amounts, the agreement. It was all there, undeniable. But what was even more undeniable was the way her father's name appeared at the bottom of the page, next to the old man's. How could she have missed this for so many years? The details of her father's dealings, the legacy of his power, the very bank she ran, it was all rooted in something she had never known. I was a partner in that bank, the old man said, his voice growing stronger with each word. When it was born, when it was pure. But your father, he turned it into something else. He sold it to the highest bidder. And in doing so, he sold me out. And now, you stand here, managing it, profiting from it, all while ignoring the truth that I built this place. His words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. The room held its breath. Everyone watched, unsure of what would happen next. Why didn't you fight then? Miss Ramsey asked, still clutching the paper. Why wait all these years? The old man's face softened for a moment, just a flicker of vulnerability, but it passed quickly, like a cloud over the sun. Because I needed to see what you would do, he said simply. I needed to see if you would be like him, if you would ignore your history, your true legacy, or if you would honor it. A shiver ran down Ms. Ramsey's spine. The truth of what he was saying hit her harder than any harsh word or accusation could have. She had built her life on the very thing he had created, and yet, she had never truly known the foundation of it all. Her father's empire was built on lies, on the blood, sweat, and sacrifices of people like him. The silence in the room grew unbearable. Miss Ramsey felt the weight of the old man's words pressing down on her. She had always seen her father as a figure of strength, someone who had built Eldridge Bank into what it was today. He had always told her stories of hard work, of sacrifice, of being a self-made man. But now, in the presence of this stranger, she could see the cracks in that image, the lies that had been carefully woven into the fabric of her understanding. For the first time, she wasn't sure of who she was, or who her father had truly been. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, her voice shaky but determined. Why not sooner? Why wait until I'm running the bank? The old man's gaze never wavered. He had expected this question. It was the only question that mattered now. Because I needed to see if you were worthy, he said, his voice soft yet firm. I needed to know if you had the strength to confront the truth. You see, Your father, he wasn't who you think he was. He was a man of ambition, yes, but that ambition turned to greed. He betrayed me, and in doing so, he betrayed the very people who trusted him. Miss Ramsey's heart pounded in her chest as she absorbed his words. The truth, once hidden beneath layers of well-crafted stories, was beginning to surface, and with it came the undeniable weight of guilt. How could he do this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. How could he sell out everything he built? The old man stepped closer, his presence imposing yet calm, because he saw an opportunity, and he took it. It wasn't just about money, though. It was about power. He wanted more, and in the end, he got it. But at what cost? The room seemed to shrink further, the air thick with tension. Miss Ramsey's mind raced as she processed the revelation. This wasn't just about money or a bank, it was about betrayal, about the legacy of her father. She had been raised on the myth of his greatness, but now that myth was crumbling, piece by piece. The old man turned and walked slowly toward the back of the room, where a large painting hung on the wall. He gestured toward it, his hand sweeping through the air. Look at that, he said. That's the image they've sold you, the image of a man who built something out of nothing. But it's a lie. Your father didn't build this bank. I did. I gave him the chance to make it something great, but he chose greed. And now, you're reaping the rewards of that choice. Miss Ramsey stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the painting. The portrait of a man who had once been a hero in her eyes now felt like a shadow, a distant memory she no longer recognized. Her thoughts swirled. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was one she didn't want to see. She had built her life on the foundation of someone else's lies, and now, the very thing she had held so dear was slipping through her fingers. The old man's voice interrupted her thoughts. You can't undo the past, he said, his tone hardening, but you can choose what you do with the future. You can choose to honor what was lost, or you can continue to live the lie. Miss Ramsey's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, to hold on to the image of her father that had shaped her life. But deep down, she knew he was right. Everything she had built, everything she had achieved, was tainted by the truth of her father's betrayal. Now, think about this. What do we do when we discover that everything we believed in was built on lies? How do we handle the truth when it shatters the very foundation of who we thought we were? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe. We're just getting started. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Miss Ramsey stood motionless, the truth of the old man's words consuming her from within. The room, once familiar and comforting, now felt cold and distant. The paintings on the walls, the polished wood of the desk, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, they all felt like reminders of the lies she had lived under for so long. It was as if the very space she occupied had become foreign to her. Her father's face, the image of a man she had always admired, was now nothing more than a mask, a carefully constructed facade that had crumbled in front of her eyes. She had spent her entire life believing in the greatness of Eldridge Bank, believing that it was built on the principles of hard work and sacrifice. But now, that belief had shattered. Everything she had worked for felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. She stared at the paper in her hands again. The signatures, the dates, the agreement, it was all there. But it wasn't just about the bank anymore. It was about her father's betrayal, and the legacy he had left behind. How could she have been so blind? How had she failed to see what was happening right in front of her? The old man's words echoed in her mind. I gave him the chance to make it something great, but he chose greed. It wasn't just greed, though. It was power, the kind of power that corrupted everything it touched. Miss Ramsey wanted to scream, to lash out, to deny the reality of what she was hearing. But instead, she remained silent, her mind whirling with questions, each one more devastating than the last. She had always been proud of her work at the bank, proud of what she had achieved, of the life she had built for herself. But now, that pride felt hollow. She had spent years following in her father's footsteps, trying to live up to the legacy he had created. But was that legacy worth preserving? Was it something she should carry forward, or something she should tear down? The old man took a step closer, his eyes fixed on hers. You can't undo what's been done, but you can choose what you do next. You can either continue down the same path your father set for you, or you can change course. The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with an intensity that left her breathless. Could she change? Could she walk away from everything she had built? The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a strange sense of possibility. What if there was another way? What if she didn't have to follow in her father's footsteps? The storm inside her grew louder, a cacophony of emotions and thoughts crashing together. Anger, fear, guilt, and hope all swirled within her, fighting for control. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: her life, her work, her entire identity had just been thrown into turmoil. "Tell me what you want me to do," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "What is it that you expect from me?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the sack he had been carrying since the beginning of this encounter and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently on the desk in front of her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Miss." Ramsey's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the object. It was a key, a simple, rusted key, but one that seemed to hold an immense weight. She didn't understand at first, but the old man's intent gaze told her it was something important, something she needed to understand. "Your father left this for you," he said quietly. "It's the key to the truth, the key to everything." "Miss." Ramsey stared at the key, her heart racing as a wave of disbelief washed over her. The simple object before her held the weight of her entire future, and yet she had no idea what it could possibly unlock. What was it that her father had left behind? What was it that had been hidden for all these years? The old man's eyes never left hers, waiting, patient as always. His silence spoke volumes, and in that moment, it became clear that the key was more than just a literal object. It was a symbol, a key to understanding the truth, a truth that had been buried under layers of deception, betrayal, and guilt. The air in the room felt heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in on her. Her mind raced, her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and anger. Her father, the man she had looked up to all her life, had been a stranger to her all along. He had built this empire on the backs of others, on betrayal and greed, and she had unknowingly carried that legacy forward. She wanted to throw the key away, to erase it all, but deep down, she knew that she couldn't. The truth had already been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The door to the past was open now, and if she wanted to truly understand who her father had been, who she was, she had no choice but to walk through it. The old man took a step closer, his voice low and measured. "What you choose to do with that key will determine everything. But be warned, it's not just the truth about your father that you'll uncover. There are things in that room, things you don't want to know." Her throat tightened. "What do you mean? What's in there?" The old man's gaze grew darker, more intense. "Things that will change everything you thought you knew about yourself, your life, and the people you trust. But you can't unsee them once you've seen them. You'll have to live with the consequences of what you choose to uncover." "Miss." Ramsey's hands trembled as she picked up the key. It felt heavier now, as though it was alive, pulsating with some hidden power. The weight of it made her chest tighten, and yet she felt a strange compulsion to hold onto it, to find out what it unlocked. She turned toward the back of the room, her gaze fixing on a small door that had always been there but had never caught her attention. The door seemed to call to her now, as if it were waiting for her to make the decision to open it. With a deep breath, she moved toward the door, the key burning a hole in her pocket. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and her every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But there was no turning back now, not after everything she had learned, not after seeing the truth of what her father had done. She reached the door and placed the key in the lock. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The door creaked open. Beyond it, the darkness was overwhelming, a vast expanse of shadow and silence that seemed to swallow the light around her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, the echoes of her footsteps the only sound in the stillness. Inside, the room was cold. A single desk sat in the center, covered in old papers, yellowed and brittle with age. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered in the corners. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But Ramsey could sense that something far more sinister lingered in this room, something that had been kept hidden for decades. She stepped further inside, her breath shallow. On the desk, there was a folder, thick and worn with age. It was labeled simply, "The Truth." She reached for it, her fingers brushing the edges of the paper, as if it might bite. Her hands shook as she opened the folder. Inside were more papers, documents, and photographs. The first photo made her stomach twist. It was of her father, but not as she remembered him. This was a different side of him, one she had never seen before. He was standing with men she didn't recognize, men whose faces were unfamiliar, but whose presence was unmistakable. The documents inside told a different story. There were financial reports, contracts, names of people she had never heard of, people who had been part of her father's world, his secret world. They were connected to shady deals, bribery, and corruption. Her eyes scanned the papers, and with each one, the truth became clearer. The man she had loved and admired was not the person she thought he was. He was part of something much darker, much larger than she had ever imagined. A name caught her eye, one she recognized, but not in the context she had known it. It was the name of someone close to her, someone who had been by her side for years, someone she trusted implicitly. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined that the person who had been closest to her could have been involved in this world, but the evidence was right there, in black and white. It felt like the ground beneath her feet was shifting. She wanted to turn and run, to forget everything she had seen, but she knew it was too late. The door had been opened, and there was no going back. Miss Ramsey felt the weight of the folder press down on her as though it had become a physical part of her, heavy with revelations she wasn't ready to face. She stood frozen in that dimly lit room, the air thick with the stench of decay and betrayal. The key, which she still gripped tightly in her hand, seemed to hum, as if it were alive with the force of secrets it had unlocked. Her thoughts scrambled, trying to piece together the tangled web of lies that her father had spun. Her breath was shallow, her mind racing. Everything she had believed about her father, the man she thought was beyond reproach, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Each new discovery felt like a layer being stripped from her soul, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. But there was more to uncover. She knew that much. The photographs had been the first blow, but the papers, they were the ones that really started to break her. Financial records, contracts, details about investments in companies that were nothing short of criminal. Her father had not only built an empire, but he had built it on the suffering of others. People had lost their livelihoods, their homes, all for the sake of Eldridge Bank's rise to prominence. But the documents weren't the worst part. No, that came later. As she went through the papers, another name emerged, one that made her blood run cold. It was the name of someone she had trusted, someone she had considered a friend, a confidant. It was James Avery, one of the senior executives at the bank. He had been there for years, always present, always a stabilizing force in the bank's operations. He had been the man who helped guide her when her father passed. But now, he was something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The papers indicated that James Avery had been involved in every shady deal her father had made. The corrupt contracts, the falsified documents, Avery's name was on all of them. The realization was like a punch to her gut. She had never questioned him, never thought that he could be part of the poison that had infected her father's legacy. But now, staring at the truth in black and white, she couldn't deny the bitter taste that rose in her throat. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. The more she read, the more she uncovered, a web of deceit stretching back decades, with countless lives destroyed in its wake. Every name she saw on those papers was a victim, each one a casualty in a game that had been played without mercy. The worst part was the realization that she had been a part of it all, unknowingly, of course, but still a part of it. She had inherited the bank, its legacy, its wealth. She had continued her father's work, had advanced his agenda, all while thinking that she was doing the right thing. She had been complicit, and the weight of that guilt threatened to crush her. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned, half expecting to find the old man standing behind her, but the room remained empty, save for the dusty furniture and the remnants of a life long gone. He had warned her about what she might uncover, but she hadn't fully understood until now. The truth was like a beast with an insatiable appetite, and the more she fed it, the hungrier it became. She couldn't stay here any longer. The room felt suffocating, the truth too much to bear. She needed air, needed to escape, if only for a moment. She grabbed the folder, stuffed it under her arm, and fled the room, her footsteps echoing in the dark hallway. The door slammed shut behind her, but even as she ran, she knew that the door to her father's world had been opened, and there was no slamming it shut again. The truth had been set loose, and there was no going back. Her mind raced as she made her way through the winding corridors of the bank. She couldn't shake the image of James Avery's name, stamped on every page of every contract. How could she have been so blind? She thought of all the conversations they'd had, the trust she had placed in him, and now, it was clear that she had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. As she approached the exit, she stopped. A chill ran down her spine once again. Her hand gripped the door handle, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She couldn't just walk away from all of this, not without facing it head-on. But what could she do? She was trapped, caught between the legacy of her father's empire and the horror of what she had uncovered. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and turned back toward the hallway. There was one more thing she needed to do, one final step in this journey into darkness. Miss Ramsey walked out of the bank into the cold night air, but it felt no more freeing than the oppressive heat inside. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but they only illuminated the shadows of the truth that had taken root inside her. She was no longer the same person who had walked into that building earlier that day. She had been transformed, reshaped by the monstrous reality of what she had uncovered. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from a deep, gnawing emptiness. The truth had come crashing down on her, and now she stood on the precipice of something far worse than she could have imagined. Every piece of evidence she had uncovered led her further down a path she wasn't ready to take, but there was no turning back. She walked through the empty streets, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. Her mind kept returning to James Avery. She could see his face in her mind's eye, the charm in his smile, the way he had always been there for her when she needed advice or support. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed mask that had hidden the rot beneath. As she moved forward, the weight of the folders seemed to grow heavier with every step, like a tangible reminder of the burden she now carried. The choices ahead of her weren't simple. She couldn't just walk away from the bank. It was her inheritance, her birthright, and the weight of generations lay on her shoulders. But could she continue her father's work after what she had learned? She stopped by a small cafe, its lights flickering weakly in the dark. She needed to think, needed to sort through the chaos in her mind. She sat down at a corner table, the folder placed before her like a damning piece of evidence. She opened it again, as if somehow reading it over and over could give her answers, could help her understand how everything had gone so horribly wrong. The coffee came, but she barely noticed it. Her hands trembled as she sipped it, the bitter taste reminding her of the bitterness in her heart. She stared at the papers, reading the same lines again, her eyes tracing the names of victims whose lives had been destroyed for the sake of the bank's empire. She could almost hear their voices, feel the pain in their words, even if they had never spoken a single one to her. She had always prided herself on being someone who could make the hard decisions, someone who could carry on the legacy of her family. But now, those decisions didn't seem so clear-cut. Every option felt like a step further away from who she once was, a journey into darkness that she wasn't sure she could survive. What could she do now? Her mind kept returning to the idea of confronting James Avery, but would it do any good? Could she expose him without exposing herself in the process? She thought of the damage it would do to the bank, to her family's reputation. The consequences would be far-reaching, and no matter how justified her actions might be, they would come with a price. A noise behind her made her turn. She froze, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a figure in the doorway, tall, with a familiar gait. For a moment, she thought it might be him, James Avery, coming to confront her, to end this game once and for all. But it wasn't him. Instead, it was someone else, someone unexpected. It was her old friend from law school, Jackson Moore. He hadn't changed much since they'd last spoken, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He walked toward her slowly, his face unreadable. "Miss Ramsey," he said quietly, taking a seat across from her. "I thought it might be you." She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jackson, I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, his gaze flicking to the folder in front of her. He didn't need to ask what it was. "You're in deep, aren't you?" he said softly. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure how to tell him the truth. There was so much to explain, and yet, no words seemed sufficient to describe the abyss she was staring into. "I'm not sure what to do," she admitted, her voice cracking with the weight of her dilemma. "I thought I could keep it all together, that I could run the bank the way my father did, but now, I see it for what it really is." Jackson's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt like someone truly understood her struggle. "You don't have to keep it all together, Leslie," he said quietly. "You have a choice. You always have a choice." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was the first time anyone had said those words to her in this entire ordeal. She had always thought she had to live up to her father's legacy, to continue the work he had started. But Jackson was right. She did have a choice. The question was, what would she do with it? Leslie sat in the dimly lit cafe, the weight of Jackson's words still heavy in her chest. For the first time since she had walked into the bank, she felt like she could breathe again, though just barely. Jackson's presence had been an anchor, a small spark of clarity in the dark storm of her thoughts. She wasn't alone in this battle. She had a choice, but making that choice was the hardest thing she'd ever faced. "Jackson, I don't know if I can do it," Leslie said, her voice breaking. She had heard herself speak those words 1,000 times before, but they had never felt more real than they did now. The decisions in front of her were monumental, and no matter what she did, it would cost her something: her family's legacy, her future, and perhaps even her own peace of mind. He placed a hand gently on her wrist, a gesture of support that meant more than any words could express. Leslie, no one can decide this for you, but you've spent your whole life trying to live up to your father's legacy, to honor a man who isn't even the same as you thought. Maybe it's time to honor yourself, to make sure your actions mean something to you, not just to him. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back tears. The idea of walking away from the bank, the institution her father had built with his own hands, the empire that had sustained their family for generations, felt like betrayal. But she couldn't ignore the truth that had been staring her in the face. Her father had built his legacy on corruption, on manipulating people for the sake of power. Could she really continue his work, knowing what she knew now? Could she live with herself if she did? I don't know who I am anymore, Leslie whispered. Jackson gave her a small smile, the first true smile she had seen from him in years. You're Leslie Ramsey. You're stronger than you think. You're not your father, and you don't have to carry his weight anymore. The bank doesn't own you. You're free to choose what comes next. The weight of his words seemed to settle inside her, a quiet truth beginning to unfold. But the path ahead was still unclear. Her heart ached as she thought of her father, of the man she had tried so hard to emulate. But in this moment, she understood what she had to do. Standing up, she grabbed the folder, clutching it tightly in her hands. It felt almost symbolic, like holding the key to a new life, a new beginning. Jackson stood with her, offering her a nod of encouragement. You know what you have to do, he said softly. Leslie didn't know exactly how it would all unfold, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to confront the truth, confront the bank, confront James Avery. She couldn't keep hiding behind her father's legacy any longer. With a deep breath, Leslie walked out of the cafe. The city around her buzzed with life, oblivious to the monumental decision she had just made. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something that had been missing for so long, a sense of control, of agency. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, it was her road. Leslie stood in front of the grand glass doors of the bank. The building loomed above her, no longer a monument of pride, but a relic of choices long buried. She wasn't the frightened girl who once shadowed her father's every step. She was no longer hiding behind old walls, behind someone else's truth. She walked in. Her heels echoed through the marble floors. Employees looked up, unsure whether to greet her or prepare for war. James Avery emerged from his office like a general stepping onto the battlefield. Miss Ramsey, he said, voice smooth, calculated. I didn't expect you back. You should have, she replied. You always knew this day would come. She handed him the folder. Inside, documents, proof, declarations. But more than that, her decision, not just to expose what had been done, but to dismantle the broken empire piece by piece, starting from within. You're making a mistake, Avery warned. No, Leslie said calmly. I'm correcting one. She turned without another word, and as she exited the building, a strange lightness took over her. Not freedom, not yet, but something close. The first step away from shadows, the first step toward something real. And somewhere, miles away, an old man sat on a park bench. He smiled as a bird landed near his worn shoes. He didn't need to know the details. He could feel it in the wind. The story had changed.